Most people put way too much emphasis on the grip, but the more important part of your future flight stick is the one you can't see on the packaging, the gimbal mechanism. This is literally the central component of the entire stick. Most of the physical strain is concentrated here, and it provides the stick's most critical function, the X and Y axis movement. The electronics on the gimbal are a separate matter. They translate your input into a digital signal for your PC via various sensors. The four most important gimbal types are cup and ball, pincer, cam and spring, and force feedback. A lot of low-cost devices use cheap and less precise cup and ball designs, like the Thrustmaster T16000M, the Logitech X56, and even the Warthog. This involves a plastic ball moving within a plastic cup, which creates significant friction. These designs come with several drawbacks. 1. Friction and wear. The friction problem causes faster wear and tear on the gimbal compared to other constructions. Also, this type of gimbal usually relies on a single centered spring to recenter the stick. The result is a strong force around the middle, which is the opposite of what you want in a flight stick. For precise control, a stick should be softer around its resting position. In flight, you're typically making subtle adjustments rather than yanking the stick in one direction. This is even true to a certain degree during a dogfight, where you're pulling sustained Gs in a turn to slot in behind your opponent. Contrary to popular belief, the pilot mostly isn't pulling the stick all the way back. Instead, they're finding the perfect balance, pulling just enough to avoid bleeding too much speed while turning. A stick with excessive centering force reduces precision, tires you out faster, and makes fine control difficult. So while a stiff stick might feel manly, it's not practical. Sure, it'll give you a workout, but you'll lose the finesse needed for accurate, sustained control, which isn't ideal. Then, to keep a cup and ball gimbal functioning, you'll need to grease it. Unfortunately, manufacturers don't provide high-quality grease, so it's on you to find something suitable. Look for a grease that doesn't dissolve plastic, is thick enough to stay in place without dripping, but not so thick that it obstructs the gimbal's movement. Next up are Pincer Gimbals. A prime example is the VKB Gladiator. They offer a significant step up in precision compared to the ball and cup design. Instead of relying on a central ball and socket, Pincer Gimbals use a pair of arms or levers that grip the gimbal mechanism and guide its movement along the X and Y axis. These arms usually pivot around metal or plastic bearings, which reduces friction and grants smoother operation in general. The design has several advantages. The first is improved smoothness. Unlike the ball and cup design, which generates a lot of friction, Pincer Gimbals typically operate with far less resistance. This makes movements feel more fluid and precise, especially during small, controlled inputs. The second is reduced wear and tear. Since the movement relies on pivoting arms rather than sliding surfaces, the mechanism experiences less physical stress over time. This translates into better durability and a longer lifespan of the gimbal. Number 3 is customizable feel and versatility. Pincer gimbals often allow for adjustments, such as swapping out springs or modifying the tension. Furthermore, they support advanced features like adjustable clutches. By removing the springs and engaging the clutches, you can prevent the stick from automatically centering. That's particularly useful for helicopter flying or transforming the stick into a throttle. The VKB Gladiator NXT Evo Omni Throttle and the Winwing Ursa Minor Space variants support these types of modifications, for example. That said, the design isn't without its drawbacks. Pincer gimbals are mechanically more complex. This means if the bearings or pivot points aren't of high quality, the mechanism can develop play over time, reducing precision. As always, maintenance plays a role. Keeping the moving parts clean and lubricated will extend the gimbal's lifespan a lot. And then there's the noticeable center bump, which is inherent to the design as well. While it's less pronounced than in some of the very rigid cup and ball gimbals, it remains noticeable. Spring and cam gimbals are popular since they give super smooth control and a lot of customization. That's because they use springs, cams, and ball bearings in conjunction. Let's check out the advantages. Number 1 is customization. The springs and cams are swappable. Essentially, a cam's profile influences the resistance curve and how the stick feels as it moves, while spring stiffness controls the overall strength of the centering force and the force needed for movement. Cams control the mechanical feel of the movement by shaping the resistance as the stick moves, creating a specific pattern of force that dictates how the stick behaves in different areas of its travel. This is like setting a sensitivity curve that affects how much input you need to move the control at a different point. A soft cam would be like having a sensitivity curve that makes movements easier in the center and then ramps up as you move further. Springs and cams work together to create the total feel of the stick. With some cams you can even simulate a slight center bump if required. While cams control the force profile across the entire movement, such as whether it's smooth or stiff at certain points, the springs affect the overall amount of force needed to move the stick from one position to another, and especially how the stick feels at rest. Secondly, space for dampers. Cam and spring gimbals are larger, which means they offer more space for big, high-quality dampers. Dampers can further smooth out the transition, especially when you're nearing the center of the stick's range. That reduces jerky movements, or you get a more gradual resistance. And as already mentioned, you can remove the springs and tighten the dampers. As a result, you get a throttle or helicopter style input, which is similar in function but with larger throw and smoother operation compared to Pincer gimbals. Third advantage, smoother control. All of that combined results in a super smooth operation of the gimbal, which is far beyond the capabilities of a ball and cup or pincer construction. And the fourth point is customizable centering force. With adjustable springs and pretensioners, you can tweak how strong the centering force is. This helps you dial in a setup that works for everything from light control to a firmer return to center feel. Pretensioners mostly are used for fine-tuning and preload your selected spring. And the fifth point is durability. These gimbals are built to last. They mostly are full metal constructions with a good supply of spare parts available. The added sturdiness lets you use grip extensions, so you can mount the stick centered on a sim rig, for example. That said, they are not perfect. Spring and cam gimbals are more complex than simpler designs, which makes them a lot more expensive. They're also bigger, so they're not always ideal for desktop setups. It's easier to build a low-profile pincer gimbal than one with a cam and spring construction. That's why we usually don't see them on gear optimized for desk use, like the Gladiator, the X52, or the Winwing Ursa Minor. And lastly, force feedback gimbals are pretty unique. And they add a whole new level of immersion to your flying experience. Here's how they work and their advantages. Number 1 is realistic force simulation. Force feedback gimbals use motors to create resistance that mimics a real-world force. This means when you're flying, you can actually feel turbulence, g-forces, or even things like wind shear. The system adjusts based on the movement of your stick, so you get dynamic feedback as you fly. The second advantage is customizable resistance. The motors constantly monitor the position of your stick through sensors, adjusting the force applied in real time. When you release the stick, the motors automatically apply force to push the stick back to the center. Via software, you can simulate different cam profiles and set the tension as you like, as well as the damping, which means you don't need to swap cams and springs anymore. Just load a profile and that's it. Thirdly, increased immersion. You get a deeper sense of being in the cockpit when you feel the resistance change as you interact with the aircraft. Whether it's pulling out of a dive or going through turbulence, the feedback makes the experience feel much more like the real thing. And fourth, enhanced precision. With force feedback, you can get more precise control. The varying resistance can help you feel exactly how much force is needed to maintain or adjust your flight path, which improves your overall control, especially in high-stakes situations like dogfights or aerobatics. They also have some drawbacks though. The first is complexity and cost. First of all, force feedback systems are far more complex than traditional gimbals, and this complexity comes at a cost. That price tag might be hard to justify unless you're really into high-end simulation. The second is size and weight. Due to the motors and additional components, force feedback gimbals tend to be bulkier and heavier than their non-force feedback counterparts. It's like comparing a dog to a whale. These things are huge sometimes. The third drawback is maintenance and durability. Force feedback gimbals have more moving parts than traditional gimbals, including motors and sensors that can wear out over time. This means more things can break, especially with frequent use. And the fourth drawback is power supply. These systems require additional power, often from a dedicated power supply brick, which can limit the setup options. They surely aren't a plug-and-play option. Some devices are even actively cooled, which adds noise and even more moving parts that might break. So force feedback adds a lot of realism, but it's not without its trade-offs. It gives you a whole new layer of control and immersion, but you'll need to weigh that against the price, complexity, and space requirements. Now that you know all this, check out my HOTAS overview here. Don't miss it, or you might end up buying crap-tier gear. It'll give you a rundown of what's available on the market right now and highlights the most important brands. I'll be uploading an updated version every year. See you there in a second.